The silver-gray car pulled up in the hot afternoon. The wheels crunched red dirt, then stopped right in front of the porch. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in a social worker's uniform, and a little girl. Her black hair was tousled, her eyes defiant, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. Walter stood on the steps, arms folded, silent. "Mr. Walter Gray?" the woman said, her voice formal. "I'm a social worker. This is Ellie, your niece." Walter nodded. He said nothing. His eyes lingered on the girl, his gaze piercing. "Your father has signed the temporary residence transfer papers. Your mother is in custody. And we don't know when she will be tried. Right now, I'm the only relative eligible to adopt her." Ellie pursed her lips and turned away. She didn't expect anyone to hug her, nor did she think she would be welcomed. The woman handed Walter the papers, signed them, and then quickly left as if she didn't want to stay a minute longer. Now there were only two people left, grandfather and grandson. Ellie's bedroom was the empty room on the left side of the hallway, which had been the old equipment shed. Walter had cleaned it up roughly, spreading an old mattress on the iron bed, placing a nightlight and an old-fashioned clock radio. "Breakfast is 6. Don't leave the house without me. Don't go down to the shed. Don't touch a gun," Walter said, as if he were training a new recruit. His voice was as dry as winter pine. Ellie didn't bother to reply, just dragged her backpack into the room and slammed the door. The evening on the farm was eerily quiet. No cars, no streetlights, only the sound of insects and the wind blowing through the glass windows. Ellie lay curled up on the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She had never slept so quietly, so quiet that her heart could hear it clearly. In the other room, Walter sat at the wooden table, cleaning his pistol as a ritual before bed. He heard Ellie's door creak open, a light step, then silence. He knew, but he didn't react. Instead, he put the gun back in the drawer, locked it, and let out a sigh that was either tired or sad. The next day, Ellie skipped breakfast. She wandered around the farm, holding her phone, but it had no signal. When she entered the barn, Walter caught her, and all he said was, "I don't joke about rules." Ellie looked at him with hatred, but this time she didn't argue. There was something in his eyes, an invisible scar, that sent a chill down her spine. By evening, it began to rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Ellie sat on the porch, hugging her knees, looking down at the creek at the foot of the hill, where the trees flickered in shadow. She had no idea that tomorrow, that would be where everything would turn. And he, the man she thought was a cold rock, would do something she would never forget. It had been overcast since early morning. Gray clouds had covered the hills, the air thick with the smell of damp and earth. The radio in the kitchen played a monotone voice, "Heavy rain forecast. Flash flood warning for downstream areas. Residents are advised to limit their time outdoors and avoid the stream." Walter turned off the radio and glanced out the window. The wind was blowing across the pasture, making the roofs of the barns creak. He opened a drawer, checked his flashlight and spare batteries, then went to the sandbag shed, carefully stacking them on the edge of the bank near the cowshed. Ellie sat on the chair, her legs dangling, not touching the ground. She rested her chin on her hand, sighing. Breakfast had been served but left untouched. "No internet, no TV, no people," she muttered, looking out the steamy window. "It's like a juvenile detention center." Walter didn't answer. He pulled on his raincoat, put on his hat, grabbed his flashlight, and turned. "Don't go outside, especially near the stream. The road there could collapse." Ellie pursed her lips. "I'm not a kid." He looked at her for a second longer than usual. Then he went out, closing the door. The rain started coming down around 10 in the morning, heavy, steady, like a thick blanket covering the valley. The sound of it mingled with the wind, the creaking of wood, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the stream growing louder. Ellie sat in her room, watching the drops of water fall diagonally across the glass, then turned back to her phone, which had no signal, no messages, no calls, no connection. She tiptoed to the door, peeked around. Walter was nowhere to be seen. She put on her coat, pulled on her hat, and opened the front door a crack, the rain pouring in like an angry waiting sky. The path to the stream was slippery, but Ellie kept walking. She had been down here a few times, where there were large rocks to sit on and a few frogs to cheer her up. This time the stream was no longer a gentle, clear stream. It was bubbling, muddy, strong, and smelled of washed-up dirt. She stood on a large slab of rock, water splashing around her ankles. Her heart was pounding, partly with fear, partly with excitement. It felt like a small victory to defy the ban. She took a few more steps to the outcrop, but just then, the slab slipped beneath her. Ellie fell backward, losing her balance, and the water, like a predator, pounced on her. Walter returned to the house after checking the west fence and found the door open. There were small muddy boot prints on the porch. They couldn't be his. He growled, "Ellie?" No answer. He threw off his raincoat and ran down to the shed, grabbing his binoculars and walkie-talkie. There was a map of the hill country on the table. He scanned it quickly, then dashed toward the path leading down to the stream. Ellie didn't know how far she'd been swept. Water lashed at her face, her chest, and branches and roots rose up like blades to scrape at her limbs. She thrashed about, her eyes stinging, her mouth full of mud. A large dry branch floated towards her. She instinctively grabbed it. Her arms clung, and luckily the current forced her to stay between the roots of an ancient tree growing close to the bank. There she was, trapped like a rag doll in the howling wind and the foam. "Help," she hoarsely said, but the thunder swallowed her plea for help. Walter stood on the edge of the hill, his eyes darting through the rain. His binoculars were blurred with water, but he could see a bright red patch, Ellie's hood, caught on a tree in the middle of the stream. He ran down the slope, slipped, got up, and ran again. He used his knife to cut a rope from a fence post, wrapped it around himself, and tied the other end to a tree. Walter waded into the stream. The cold water bit at his skin. Every step was a battle with mud and current. Ellie was limp, but her eyes were open. When she saw him, her lips moved soundlessly. He put his arms around her, tied the rope, and dragged them both back to shore as if wrestling with a demon. It took him nearly 20 minutes to drag Ellie to safe ground. He squeezed the water from her lungs, punched her chest, and gave her artificial respiration. There was a gagging sound, and Ellie vomited mud and water. She was breathing, shaking, weak, but alive. On the way home, Walter carried Ellie on his back, his shirt stained with mud, his hands bleeding. She hugged his neck, saying nothing. No longer a rebellious child, no longer a stranger. He said nothing either, but when they got home, he made her a cup of hot cocoa, then sat beside her in silence. His eyes, for the first time, were no longer cold as steel. 5 days after the flood, the sun was still not out. The clouds were still drifting in the distance, but the pastures were dry and the creek no longer roared as it had the day before. Life on the farm had returned to a normality that was almost unreal. Walter repaired the roof of the barn that had been warped by the wind. And Ellie, after her near-death experience, stopped sneaking out. She quietly cleaned up, helped her grandfather light the fire, and fed the chickens. They still spoke little, but something had quietly changed. There was no more confrontation, only caution, like two survivors of a war. Early one morning, Walter was sipping his coffee as usual when he saw a strange car pull up outside the farm gate. A local reporter got out, young, disheveled, holding a camera and a clipboard. "Mr. Gray, this is Sam Jennings, with the Willow Creek Times." The young man nodded. "We heard about the granddaughter rescue from the flood. A real-life hero story. I was hoping you could share a few words." Walter squinted, looking uncomfortable, but Ellie was standing next to him, looking at him expectantly. There was something in her eyes that made him nod. The photo shoot was quick. Walter stood on the porch, his hand resting lightly on Ellie's shoulder, his face stony. Ellie gave a small smile, not for the camera, but for the grandfather who risked his life for her. 3 days later, the newspaper ran with the headline, "Heroic Grandfather, Granddaughter Rescued from Flood." It was accompanied by a photo of the two of them, one's eyes like forged steel and the other like the morning sun. The article was shared on the town's social media, a place that no one seemed to notice, but where the undercurrents always had room to creep in. And that article, though small, went further than Walter thought. Very far. thousands of miles across the ocean. In a subterranean room lined with lead and anti-interference metal, a man opened a printed article from the web. He was tall, bald, wearing a white shirt, black gloves. He didn't read, he looked. The photo. The old man with the unmistakable look in his eyes. Walter Gray, he muttered, his voice like a stone dropped into a deep well. You're still alive. Beside him, an assistant whispered, do you need to verify? He shook his head. No need. I know that look. It was the last thing I saw, before I lost this one. He pointed to the dark-rimmed eye on his left, then stood up and looked out the window at the city, dimmed by the rain. This time, I'll get it all back. And this time, you'll lose the most precious thing. Walter sat in his old room, turning the pages of maps and documents. He couldn't sleep after rereading the article. Something was unsettling in his chest, not an emotion, but an instinct, the instinct that had kept him alive all those years as a spy. A vague feeling like the headlights in the rearview mirror, something that was approaching but not yet visible. He went down to the basement. The basement was hidden behind bookshelves, accessed by rotten wooden stairs. Inside, everything was the same as it had been 10 years ago: guns, maps, files, spy equipment that was now old but never useless. Walter opened a metal box. Inside was a black and white photograph, a bald man in a foreign uniform. His face cut across by a long scar. Below the photo were the words, Victor Novak, Silver Wolf, MISSING 2015. Walter muttered, it can't be, you're dead. But he knew, that feeling was never wrong. The next morning, Walter reinstalled the cameras around the farm. He adjusted the motion sensor alarm system, checked the simple traps near the door, things he had promised he would never use again. Ellie stepped out onto the porch, holding a cup of hot cocoa, looking at him in surprise. Why did you do that? Walter didn't turn around. Rats. There are rats here too? He nodded. Not many, but when they do, they're usually dangerous. She didn't understand everything, but there was something in his voice that made her shiver. It was no longer raining in September, but the air was still heavy with thunder. Crows were flying low over the sun-baked fields, cawing hoarsely and ominously. Walter woke at dawn. He hadn't slept deeply for many nights, but he didn't need a clock. His body still functioned as it had when he was an agent, early risers. Quick meals, eyes open but ears still listening for the slightest sound. This morning, he cleaned out the basement, not for nostalgia, but for preparation. On the table were a Glock 19, 2 daggers, a radio, a few packs of bandages, and an old faded sketch. Walter spread them out, like an artist before starting to recreate an old stage. What he had locked away, his skills, his reflexes, his old anger, were slowly being reawakened. Layers of time dust brushed away without hesitation. There was no hatred in his heart, only responsibility. Ellie reminded him that he wasn't alive to run away. Ellie was sitting in the shade of an oak tree, reading a worn comic book. She still didn't quite understand why her grandfather had been so tense these past few days. He'd closed the cellar door, adjusted the cameras, dug in the dirt behind the house. He was preparing something, she knew, but she hadn't dared to ask. Ellie, Walter called, his voice deeper than usual. Come in. She entered the main house, following him down to the basement, for the first time, without being forbidden. You need to learn something, he said, picking up a small notebook and tossing it onto the table. They don't teach it in school. Ellie looked around the cellar, her eyes wide with surprise. The walls were covered with weapons, maps, papers marking locations, and things she'd only seen in movies. You're a spy? She swallowed. Walter didn't answer. He raised his hand, placing a dagger on the table. Take it. Ellie looked at him, thinking he was joking, but he was serious. You need to learn how to defend yourself, how to hide, how to distract. If you ever get caught, you have to have a chance to survive. Catch you? Ellie took a half step back. What are you talking about? Walter took a deep breath. You've been exposed, Ellie. People know you're my niece. And if they want to hurt me, they'll come for you. Over the next few days, the farm became a miniature training camp. Walter led Ellie around the perimeter of the land, teaching her how to read footprints, how to listen for irregularities in the wind. He taught her to signal with mirrors, to tie escape ropes, and how to run when chased. At first, Ellie was afraid, but then, she felt stronger every day. Not superhero-like strength, but strength that comes from knowing you're no longer powerless. Every night, they ate dinner together around the wooden table. Ellie told stories about school. Walter told stories of old times, not about spies, but about climbing plum trees. About the dog ranger he'd had as a kid. The coldness between them slowly melted. What remained was camaraderie, a rare thing between two generations. On Friday night, Walter went to check the barn as usual and saw something was wrong. A cow was missing. The ropes were cut, not cut naturally. The grass around them had been trampled in a very clear direction, from the west fence. He went back to the house and turned on the camera again. A blurry recording, as if something had interfered. Walter clenched his jaw. They were getting closer. 3 in the morning. A strange sound came from the barn. Ellie woke up, her heart pounding. She reached for her flashlight, and saw Walter standing right in front of her door. Quiet, here. Walter drew his gun, moving as fast as a shadow. Disappearing into the night. Outside, the sensor lights flickered on, then off. A man dressed in black, his face masked, was sneaking through the chicken coop. But as he touched the door, there was a click, and wire mesh sprang from above, wrapping around him like a spider web. Walter stepped forward, gun raised. He pulled out a knife. But before he could swing it, Walter kicked him in the knee, knocking him to the ground. A clean blow to the back of his neck ended it all. The next morning, the local police came. Walter didn't say much, just said, "Cattle thieves." But Ellie knew, and there was something different in her eyes. It was no longer an innocent look. She looked at him as if he were someone who could defeat all darkness, but also knew that light was being threatened by something much bigger. Walter turned to her, his voice as calm as if he were talking about breakfast. "Starting tomorrow, we'll be learning about battlefield first aid." The sky was darkening into twilight. Deep gold, then deep purple. The countryside was silent, as if all nature were holding its breath before a storm that brought not rain, but blood. Walter sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the western woods, where the air had changed since early morning. The dogs had stopped barking, the wind had changed, and the snapping of branches was not in rhythm with the wind. He knew, today was the day they came. In the basement, Ellie was wearing a tight black t-shirt, gloves on her hands, and soft shoes on her feet. She didn't ask any more questions. She knew exactly what she had to do. And she trusted him, not just her grandfather, but the only person in the world who knew how to survive. Walter handed her a small backpack, first aid kit, folding knife, flashlight, homemade disposable taser. "Don't leave the basement without the all clear," he instructed, his eyes never leaving her. "Remember the G rule? Hide, pin, call," Ellie said simply. "Find a safe place, stay put, mark your location if you can, and call for backup." Walter nodded slightly, proud, but not showing it. 9:12 p.m. The lights around the farmhouse went out. The main power supply was cut. Walter let out a soft breath. They're right on time. He turned on the backup, a military-grade battery in the basement. A soft red glow spread around the house, just enough to illuminate the path, just dark enough to hide the target. One stranger crawled low under the fence. A second took cover behind the cowshed. 3 others split from the woods, surrounding the entire farmhouse. 6 in all, just as Walter had predicted. The first one approached the front door. As he stepped over the steps, the false panel collapsed, a small chimney spewing tear gas from the ground. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the pain. From the second floor, Walter fired a silent shot, not to kill, just to rip the shoulder of his shirt. Blood spread quickly. Panic spread through the enemy formation like ripples on a still lake. The second man made it into the warehouse. He rummaged through every crate, but found no one. When he opened the last cabinet door, a series of miniature flares went off, temporarily blinding him. As he screamed, Walter appeared behind him, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed his head against the crossbar. He dropped like an empty punching bag. 2 out, 4 to go. In the basement, Ellie heard a faint thud from the floor, not his footsteps. She quietly took the knife, held her breath, and waited. The cellar door opened. A dark figure slunk down. But before he could take another step, a wire stretched across him, causing him to stumble. Ellie lunged forward, stabbed the knife into his thigh, then pulled the trigger of the stun gun and shot him in the neck. The man staggered and fell, convulsing. Ellie trembled with adrenaline, but she did not let go of the knife. She stood still, breathing heavily, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Out in the yard, the last two joined forces to attack the main house from the back door. Walter had set up 2 metal pans with wires attached, homemade electric traps. When they touched them, the electricity paralyzed their bodies. Walter stepped out, slowly, the barrel of the gun pointed at the ground. He did not fire. They were unconscious. Only one remained. From the darkness at the edge of the farmhouse, a voice rang out, deep and quiet as melting ice. "You guys have always been arrogant. Gray." Walter turned his head. Victor Novak stepped out of the shadows. White shirt on, weaponless, or perhaps not yet drawn. "Same as before," Walter said, his voice hoarse. "Send someone first and come out last. When you're sure you've won. I came to get what I owe." Victor smiled. "You owe me an eye. Now I'm getting it back, with the blood of that child." Walter slowly drew a knife from his belt. "The two of us. Nothing more to say." Victor laughed, and charged. There was no gunfire, just the sound of knives on knives. The whistling of the wind as their bodies spun in a duel between 2 old ghosts. Walter slipped, then stabbed. Victor parried, then countered. Both were old, but each move was precise and ruthless. Ellie rushed up from the basement just in time to see Victor pinning him to the ground. Knife to his throat, she screamed, and without thinking, threw the second stun gun at him. Walter caught it, and fired it straight into Victor's chest. He jerked like a fish out of water. The scream died. He fell, eyes wide, hands still clutching the hilt of the knife. Walter sat up, gasping. Ellie rushed to his side, hugging him tightly. "I didn't stay still like you told me," she stammered, her face pale. Walter chuckled, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. First time breaking orders, but good. The police arrived early the next morning. The farm was cordoned off. Victor's body was taken away, along with the survivors tied up in the cellar. Ellie sat beside him, wrapping a bandage around his arm. Walter looked at her, speaking softly for the first time. "You're a fighter, not because you hit anyone, but because you didn't run away." Ellie raised her head. She said nothing, but in her eyes he saw his own eyes, 50 years ago, standing beside his first teacher. The sun rose slowly, more gently than usual, as if it were breathing a sigh of relief from a long nightmare. The first rays of light filtered through the kitchen window, sweeping across the carpet, which was stained with mud, dried blood, and old shoe prints, evidence that this place had once been a battlefield. Walter sat in his usual wooden chair, one arm wrapped in a bandage, the other holding a cup of hot coffee. The coffee was weak today, not because of the lack of sugar, but because his taste buds had changed since last night. Ellie walked in, holding a cup of cocoa. Her hair was slightly tousled, her eyes still dark, but her gait was steadier, her shoulders straighter, and her gaze was no longer that of a child. "Did you sleep?" she asked. Walter nodded. "A little." "I didn't," Ellie breathed, then smiled. "But I'm not scared anymore." The police had left. The local station called for an interview. Several big city journalists emailed. Walter didn't reply. He didn't want to be famous. He just wanted peace. But peace wasn't what it used to be. Now, it wasn't the quiet of running away, it was the quiet of facing the past. Walter put the weapons back in the bunker. But he didn't lock it like before. He just closed the door, like someone closing a chapter of a book they'd finished reading but hadn't torn up yet. Ellie helped him clean, fix the broken fence, and replace the lock. She even drew a small sign and hung it on the bunker door. "Open only when absolutely necessary." Walter saw it, but said nothing. He smiled silently. One afternoon, Ellie brought an application for online school. She didn't want to go back to her old school. Didn't want to leave the farm. She said, "Here, I learn a lot of things that school doesn't teach. But I also want you to be assured. I won't miss out on knowledge." Walter read it over, then signed without hesitation. "What do you think you want to study?" he asked. Ellie thought about it. "I'm not sure, but maybe psychology. Or forensics. Or both." He chuckled, nodding, like family. Every morning, Walter taught her how to reassemble old radios, read military maps, analyze signals. In the afternoon, she studied online, wrote essays, and occasionally snuck out to the barn to chat with the cows like a close friend. At night, they sat together on the porch, listening to the insects, occasionally retelling old stories as if they were reading comics, but they both knew they were real memories. Once, Ellie asked, "Do you think there will be another time? Someone like Victor?" Walter was silent for a long time, then said, "Maybe, but next time, I won't be fighting alone." She nodded, not because she liked to fight, but because she now understood. Love sometimes needed to be protected with blood and steel. In late autumn, the leaves began to turn yellow. Ellie hung a few wind chimes around the porch, not for alarm, but to create wind music for the quiet afternoons. Walter received a letter from an old friend, an old partner from the Secret Service. Now a security consultant. The letter had a final line. "We knew Victor was alive. And now he is gone. You did the right thing. You are truly free. Gray." Walter folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and did not tell Ellie. He did not want her to think that the war was over because of a confirmation. For him, freedom came from not being afraid. And now, he was not afraid anymore. On the first morning of winter, when the fog was hanging over the porch, Ellie brought out 2 cups of cocoa. One for her, one for him. She placed a cake on the table, a little burnt but fragrant. Walter looked at the cake, then at her. "You've grown up, Ellie." She smiled, her eyes shining like morning dew. "And you've changed." Walter nodded. "You changed me." In a remote part of America, there was a farm nestled quietly among the hills. It was said that there was once a calm old man living there with his strange granddaughter. They didn't know the past, nor did they understand what had happened. They only knew that, since that flood, there had been 2 people, once filled with darkness, who had found light in each other. Extra story. Victor. The man WHO left in the dark. No one is born a monster. Even he, Victor Novak, was once a boy with messy blonde hair, running around the yard of the military barracks on the outskirts of Belgrade, picking wild apples and believing that war existed only in history books. He had an older brother named Milan, who taught him how to hold a gun, but was also the first to say, "Never let kindness slow you down." In 1999, when NATO bombed Serbia, Victor's house collapsed overnight. His mother died on the spot. His brother was arrested on suspicion of terrorism. Victor, 16 years old, survived by hiding in the basement. But when he stepped out onto the ground, the world was different. The boy disappeared. Only Victor remained, who learned to live by cruelty. He became a footman for a secret organization that specialized in transporting weapons, and quickly rose through the ranks thanks to his cold-blooded strategy. He was not afraid of blood, nor did he trust anyone, until he met Walter Gray, for the first time, during a bartering mission in Beirut. Walter was still a field agent then, an old American with a look that seemed to anticipate orders. Victor never forgot that day. The raid was swift and ruthless. He was not afraid of being caught. He had escaped from a base in the snowy forest, had killed people with a spoon. But what he did not expect was that Walter would spare him. "You live this time," Walter said, the gun pointed at his forehead, his hand not shaking, "because you are too young to die stupidly." Victor was only 23 then. His face was still scarred from Beirut, but his pride was shattered. Spare your life, for Walter, was the moral choice. For Victor, it was an insult. For years afterward, he was despised in the industry. The CIA pardoner, they called him. Jokingly, he rebuilt the organization, building a network from Eastern Europe to Africa. But the obsession with Walter remained, a small cut in his mind. Not deep, but never healed. Then he heard that Walter had disappeared, withdrew from the underworld. No one knew why. He thought he would feel relieved. But no, he felt empty. "No one is allowed to disappear until I get my money back." Victor muttered every night, standing in front of the mirror, watching his left artificial eye reflect the yellow light. When he saw a small article about a heroic grandfather saving his granddaughter from a flood on a rural American blog, he couldn't believe it. Walter Gray, the man who had made him a symbol of failure, was now living as a quiet farmer. Tending chickens and grandchildren? No, it couldn't be. Victor knew he would come. Not to kill Walter, that was easy. But to make Walter feel lost. Like he had lost everything. "You saved her once," he said in his mind, studying Ellie's picture, "but this time, who will save her from me?" He didn't need ransom, didn't need information, didn't need anything. He just needed to look into Walter's eyes and see the fear he had felt all those years ago. But he was wrong. Walter wasn't afraid. Walter was aging, slowing down, but his eyes were still the same as they had been in Beirut, razor sharp. Colder than ice. And this time, no one would spare him. As Victor fell, convulsing in the farmland, he caught sight of the little girl's face, Ellie, running to hug her grandfather. There was no fear in her eyes. Only light, a light he had never known. Not in the bomb shelter. Not in the Beirut night. Not even in his dreams. He didn't get to say the last words. But if he could, he would have said, "If only you had shot me that year, Walter, I wouldn't have lived in the dark for so long."